Hi, let us discuss SA 610 using the work of internal auditor. This standards focusing on two key areas. One is direct usage and another is direct assistance. If the auditor obtains the usage of internal audit functions or direct assistance, it is his sole responsibility to express an opinion on financial statement. And a special rule, when the auditor avail the direct assistance of internal auditor, then it is the solely responsibility of external auditor to direct the internal auditor how to do the work, supervise what are the work performed by the internal auditor, review the work to ensure the quality control. And the standard is not applicable for direct usage if the entity does not have an internal audit function, or the entity have an internal audit functions but it is not relevant for the purposes of external auditor, or based on the preliminary assessment of functions auditor obtain high risk of material misstatement, the probability of misstatement may be higher. In that situation also the external auditor will not use the function of internal auditor. Similarly, the direct assistance will not be used if the laws and regulations prohibit such use. For an example, banking regulations prohibit the direct usage, or it cause a threat on the objectivity. In that situation also the direct usage will not be considered appropriate. Then there is a relationship between the risk assessment process and this essay. So we have to understand the internal audit functions and the environment in which it's operate. So that is the relationship established. How internal audit functions operate. What are the internal audit, internal controls, what are the governing structure? We have to understand that. See, for understanding those functions, following factors are important. Nature of responsibilities and internal audit functions, organizational structure. Where this internal audit functions is stand, to whom they are reporting, whether they are reporting to the middle level management or those charges with governance. If those who charges with governance are reported person, then internal audit functions will go more effectively and more smoothly. Size and structure of the entity, whether the simple or complicated structure, and whether the management has any additional requirement. Preliminary understanding, we already discussed this essay require to evaluate, to understand the internal audit function and the environment in which it's operate. Whether it is a high risky area, then leave, we should not use or avail the direct assistance. However, if the internal auditor's functions used by the external auditor for obtaining necessary audit evidence, then following has the impacts. It will modify the nature and timing of audit procedure, or it's reduce the extent of audit procedure carried out by the external auditor. It is the responsibility of external auditor to express an opinion on financial statement. His work cannot be reduced or curtailed, even if the fact that he used the internal audit functions or obtained the direct assistance. And the objective of the standard. Here it is a decision making process. We are classifying into two. For the direct usage, auditor has to decide whether opt for using the internal audit function. If yes, we can use, then to what area and to what extent. If the auditor decide for direct assistance, then he has to plan, direction, supervision and control. And we will move into the definition of what is an internal audit functions. A function within the entity that performs assurance and consulting activity. Why? Which is designed to evaluate and improve entities governance, entities risk assessment and entities internal control process, and we are opting to use those services. If we opt for using internal audit function, then our first decision is determine in which areas and to what extent the work can be used. Evaluating the internal audit function, we have to understand the internal audit functions and the environment, how it is operate within the entity, the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational structures and status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objective of internal audit. That is the first test. Level of competency of internal audit functions, whether the internal audit functions apply a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control, how they are functioning. The external auditor shall consider the nature and scope of work that has been performed or planned to be performed by the internal audit functions, its relevance to the extent of external auditors' overall audit strategies and plan. He has to consider the nature and scope. What are the works plans to be used? The external auditor shall make all significant judgment. That judgment functions will not be entrusted to the internal audit team to prevent undue use of the work of internal audit function. That is essential. The external auditor shall also evaluate whether using the internal audit function to the extent planned would result the overall audit objective of the auditor. If we use, will it be fruitful for the overall audit plans? The external auditor shall, in accordance with SA 260, communication with those charged with governance, has to communicate clearly how he planned to use the work of internal audit function. If the external auditor plans to use the work of internal audit function, the external auditor shall disclose and discuss the planned use of, it's a planned use of the function, how the auditor is planned to use the work of internal audit. That is the main aspects. The external auditor shall read the internal audit report, has to read, and he has to apply the necessary audit procedure to evaluate the adequacy of the work. That is the main work. We are using the work of internal audit function. So what are the work performed? Auditor has to check substantive audit procedure, a validity check. He has to apply audit procedure to ensure that the work performed by the internal audit functions are adequate for the external auditor's functions. Then if we opt for direct use, the work of the function has been planned, performed and supervised and reviewed. If opt for direct assistance, then auditor has to direct, supervise and review. Sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been obtained to enable the functions to draw a reasonable conclusions. Conclusions reached are appropriate in the circumstances in which the report prepared by the functions which are consistent with the result performed. Nature and extent of external auditors' functions shall be responsive. The nature and extent of external audit procedure shall be responsive to the external auditor's evaluation of the what are the judgments involved. Risk of material misstatement. The extent to which internal audit functions, organization status, relevant policies and procedure support the objectivity of internal auditor, and level of competency of the functions and shall include the re-performance of the work. Then the direct assistance area, determining whether the internal auditor can be used to provide direct assistance for the purpose of the auditor. If yes, the internal auditor to provide direct assistance is not prohibited by, it should not be prohibited by laws and regulations. Second, the external auditor plans to use the work of internal auditor to provide direct assistance on audit. The external auditor shall evaluate the existence and significance to the threat to the objectivity and level of competency of independent auditor. He has to evaluate whether such use will hamper the objectivity and competency. The external auditor shall not use the work of internal audit for direct assistance if there are significant threats which will hamper the objectivity, or the internal auditor lacks sufficient competency to perform the work. Determining the nature and extent of work can be assigned to the internal auditor in providing direct assistance. Certain parameters are governed in determining the nature and extent of work that may be assigned to the internal auditor, and nature, timing and extent of direction, supervision and review that is appropriate in the circumstances which is warranted, the amount of judgment involved in planning and performing audit procedure, evaluate the audit evidence gathered and assess the risk of material misstatement, the external auditor's evaluation of existence and significance of threat to the objectivity and level of competency of the internal auditor who will perform such assistance, having appropriately evaluated whether and if so, to what extent the internal auditor can be used to provide the direct assistance on audit. The external auditor shall, in accordance with SA 260, assistance so much as to reach the mutual understanding that such use is not excessive in the circumstances of the engagement. Evaluation. The external auditor shall evaluate whether using the internal audit function to provide direct assistance to the extent planned together with proposed use of the work of internal audit function would result in external auditor being sufficiently involved in the audit. Using internal audit. Prior to the using internal auditor to provide direct assistance of the audit, the external auditor shall obtain a written agreement from the authorized representative of the entity that the internal auditor will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instructions and that the entity will not intervene in the work of the internal auditor to perform for the external auditor. Obtain a written agreement from the internal auditor that they will keep confidentiality of the specific matters. Direction, supervision and review. The external auditor shall direct, supervise and review the work performed by the internal auditor on engagement in accordance with SA 220. Supervision, directions and review by the external auditor of the work performed by the internal auditor shall be sufficient in order for the external auditor to be satisfied that the internal auditor have obtained sufficient and appropriate audit evidence to support the conclusions based on the work. And what are the work performed that will be documented. This is our discussions of the essay. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.